to keep the community connected through lifelong learning. And to supplement the courses, we also provide public programs like tonight's program. Open Circle Jewish Learning and Adult Learning are part of the community education arm of Hebrew College. Hebrew College's informal community education programs, in combination with the pluralistic graduate leadership programs, including our rabbinic and cantoral and graduate school of education, serve all segments of the Jewish community under the leadership of our president, Rabbi Sharon Cohen Anisfeld, and she would like to say a few words at this time.
Oh dear, my apologies. Sorry about that. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much, Lena. And it's really just wonderful to see everyone here tonight. Really exciting to see such a wonderful turnout. Wonderful because we all have the opportunity to learn from a talented, thoughtful, visionary Jewish educator and leader this evening. And wonderful also because of what I think these screens full of faces say about our collective commitment to learning, to growth, to change for the sake of racial justice, not just somewhere out there, but here within us and among us, in our communities, in our families, in ourselves. As I was thinking about this, this evening, I was thinking about one of my teachers and colleagues, friends, member of our faculty, has had a cartoon up on his office door for many years. The first frame of the cartoon has a crowd of people standing before a speaker, and the speaker is saying, "Who wants change?" And everyone in the crowd has their hands raised high. And then in the second frame of the cartoon, the same crowd of people is standing before the same speaker, but now the speaker is saying, "Who wants to change?" And not a single hand in the crowd is raised. It's funny, of course, because it's so familiar and we all know how hard change can be and how mightily we resist it sometimes. But I'm so heartened by the fact that when Hebrew College made a commitment this year as an institution to racial justice, and when we said that commitment would entail our own learning and growth and our own willingness to change, there were lots and lots and lots of hands raised high. So like the hands of the staff who have been organizing programs like this one tonight for the wider community, like the hands of students who've organized their own racial justice committee, like the hands of the staff from across the college who've launched a racial justice, a college-wide racial justice committee to really help us. I'm sorry. Like the hands of the members of college-wide racial justice committee that has been working all year, and it will continue to work, really helping us learn more about how we can walk this walk as an institution. So as we celebrate Purim later this week, we will, among other things, we'll be wearing masks and costumes. And in doing so, we'll be reminding ourselves and each other that we are each more than one thing.
I want to make it louder.
We are, we each contain multitudes. And when we flatten each other or ourselves into only one aspect of ourselves, we flatten the divine presence in whose image we are all created. So I really want to just thank you all for being here tonight, for raising your hands to help make the Jewish community, to help make our community a more just community, a more inclusive community, a more whole and holy
Okay.
community, reflecting the fullness of who we are. So thank you so much, Tema, for being with us tonight, for teaching us tonight. And thank you, Lena, for all your work. I know there have been others involved, but thank you so much for all your work all year, but in particular in bringing us together this evening.
Thank you, Rabbi Cohen-Anisfeld, for your work, and you're welcome. So now I'd like to introduce our speaker. Tonight we're going to hear from Tema Smith, who is a diversity advocate, a writer, and Jewish community builder. She is currently the Director of Professional Development at 18 Doors, an organization that empowers people in interfaith relationships to engage in Jewish life and make Jewish choices, and encourages Jewish communities to welcome them. Previously, she was Director of Community Engagement at Holy Blossom Temple, its oldest synagogue. Tema is also a contributing columnist at The Forward, and her writing has been published in My Jewish Learning, The Globe and Mail, and the Canadian Jewish News. Over the past 10 years, Tema has worked to advance the conversation on racially diverse Judaism, working with organizations like B'chol Lashon, the Reconstructionist Rabbinical College, the Miles Nadal JCC, CJPAC, and conducting trainings and presentations for numerous Jewish organizations, including the CRC, the Jewish Federation of Greater Charlotte, the Jewish Democratic Council of Hillel International, Limud North America, the JCRC of Greater Washington, the Buffalo JCRC, Hadassah, the AJC, and the ADL. Tema is also a member of the Nexus Task Force, examining the issues at the nexus of Israel and anti-Semitism in America, hosted at the Knight Program in Media and Religion at the USC Annenberg School of Communication and Journalism. So tonight's topic is American Jews and Whiteness, a Complicated Conversation. I'm going to make it so that you can put your questions in the chat, and I'll be attempting to moderate all of these. And then Tema will answer the questions at the end of her presentation. So I'm going to ask you all to make sure that you're muted, and I'm going to do the same thing, and I will call up Tema. So please help me welcome Tema.
Hi, everybody. It is so nice to be with you. There's something very special for me about being with the Hebrew College community, both as a graduate of the Interfaith Family's Jewish Engagement Program a few years ago, and also as somebody 18 Doors, while I am sitting in Toronto, 18 Doors is actually, our home is in Natick. So the Boston area is a place that I spend some time, and if not in person, at least in virtual meetings pretty well daily. So it's very nice to be in community with you all tonight and to learn together, because I very much think of the experience of teaching as a learning experience. I have done versions of this talk in a few different communities, and every time something in the questions has got something going in my head that I try to bring to the next one. So that's very much where I come from on this sort of approach to we're all here sort of in community learning together. I just want to give you one fast sort of disclaimer, which is that I have an 8-month-old puppy who is extremely let's call it the defiant phase. So if I like look off camera or vanish like really quickly, I promise I'll be right back, probably holding a dog. And I apologize for any chaos. Number one. Number two is I had nothing major, but I had some dental work done today. So if I like stop talking, my jaw just needs a small rest. I promise I will continue. So without further ado, I'm going to share my slides and walk through this presentation with you. So as Lena said, today what we're talking about is Jews, race, and whiteness, which I'm sure we all know is a very complicated conversation. So we're going to talk about a handful of things today, really just to give you sort of a guided tour of where we're going. We're going to talk a little bit about what race is and ethnicity, the distinction between social and legal exclusion, which is sort of a thing that a way that I conceptualize things. It's not necessarily something that is like a theoretical framework or anything, but it's just a way that helps me to parse some of the complications here. A little bit of an exploration of what whiteness means today, and then, of course, what we're here to talk about. What does this mean for Jews? And then a quick little detour at the end to talk specifically about Jews of color. So situating myself in the conversation, because I really like to start there. This little person you see in this fuzzy picture on the shoulders of this guy in his Birkenstocks is me. Beautiful place in Ontario, Cheltenham Badlands. They're actually like these gorgeous clay badlands. And the woman with her hair blowing in the wind is my mother. It's not super clear from the picture, but my mother is a white Ashkenazi Jew. Her mother, both of her parents were born in Canada, but have like older siblings who weren't. My grandmother's family came as immigrants from Poland in the 20s. My grandfather's family came as refugees from Romania, also in the 20s. And my mom grew up in what was a very waspy Toronto neighborhood. Incidentally, it's where I live now, and it's like nothing like what it was when she was a kid. I actually look out at her street, which is very strange. So that's sort of where my mom is coming from. And my father is his family's from the Bahamas. Shortly before he was born, they settled in New York and moved to Staten Island, New York, shortly after he was born. So he grew up a Black American man on Staten Island, which if you know New York at all, know is not exactly the place you expect if you meet somebody Black from New York, they would be from. And even less so in the 50s and 60s. My father went to mostly all white schools. He went to, his family was very devout Catholic, is very devout Catholic except for him, and went to a seminary prep school on the Upper West Side. And as he approaches his 50th high school reunion, he's been reminiscing, and he called me and he said, now that I think about it, there was the Polish clique, there was the Irish clique, there was the Italian clique, and there was me. So he grew up really steeped in anti-Black racism in all aspects of his life. It was the community he lived in, it was the school he went to, and unfortunately the church who provided the school he went to. My dad and my mom met in New York. They moved to Canada shortly after. I asked my mom recently after somebody asked me if it was a safety thing for them. And I just kind of immediately said yes, without really thinking about it. And then I thought, this is the kind of thing I should probably confirm. That's a pretty big assumption to jump to, is that they weren't safe in New York as a mixed race couple. And my mom said, no, absolutely. It was not safe for us. And like named a whole bunch of actually terrifying incidents. My brother and I grew up in downtown Toronto, outside of Jewish life. My mother didn't grow up going to synagogue, so this isn't like that crazy, but we grew up outside of Jewish life. Our sort of connection to Judaism and Jewish culture was very home-based. And every Saturday, my grandparents would take us to a dairy restaurant for lunch or dinner or something. And that was where sort of I had my first experiences of recognizing that I was very other from the rest of the Jews in Toronto. There's a lot that I don't remember, but the stories that my mom has told me now that I'm, old enough and this is what I do for a living, about some of the experiences that we had are, for example, we were walking out of the restaurant with my grandfather, me and my brother, and somebody sitting at a table mused quite loudly, adopted. And my grandfather turned around and tore a shred off of her, as he was wont to do. He was very proud of, we're his only grandkids. We were his only grandkids. My grandmother's yard site was today, so I feel very close to them today. You know, he was not going to have people thinking that we were not his grandkids somehow. Not that there was anything wrong with adoption, but the assumption that was made that this could not, this little, and truthfully, it was probably more about my brother than me, this little mixed race kid with sort of caramel colored skin and tighter curls. My hair actually got curlier as I got older, was clearly not the biological child of their daughter, clearly. And so that was kind of the context that I grew up in. And a lot of the context I grew up in was my mother protecting me from that. So as I got older and started exploring Jewish community, what was the first thing I did? Looked for families like mine, looked for people who grew up like me. And it took a very long time to find, I will be honest, but I found them. And as I started to get steep deeper and deeper into Jewish life and learning and community, and I've been a Jewish professional. Next week will be my 12th anniversary of becoming a Jewish professional, which is kind of wild to think about. Time goes very quickly. But, you know, this has been sort of my official professional path for a dozen years. As I sort of got really steeped in that context, there were questions that kept coming to me around identity and parsing how I fit. You know, as conversations, especially over the last number of years, have blown up around race, what does it mean to be mixed race and Jewish? And what does it mean for Jews who are, you know, Ashkenazi with no, like, Ashkenazi ethnicity, which I'll talk about in a second, to define their race? Part of this interest, I will also say, stemmed from my mother, who is a therapist and was doing doctoral research on the experience of race for white mothers of mixed race kids. And as a qualitative researcher I think it's been a while, I think she had nine participants, and of the 9, 6 were Jewish women. And so she actually ended up branching off and doing a side project because some of the issues that the Jewish women experienced were very different, especially because of the way that being a Jew is simultaneously racialized, and I'm going to define that word in a second, and not. So that's kind of where I sit and how I come to this. One term that I'm going to define now, because otherwise I will forget to define it, is racialized. The term racialized is something that's very frequently used in Canada. So for example, instead of saying people of color, generally speaking here, we say racialized groups. And really it is an attempt to understand that there's no meaning to race outside of the social meaning we give it. And I'm going to talk a bit more about what that means in a moment. So racialization understands that it's like an active process of giving meaning to race. So I use the language racialized a lot, and then people are always like, hold on, what do you mean racialized? Because I just assumed everyone used it, and it turns out it's like a Canadian thing. So I happen to like it better because it focuses not on the fact that somebody is phenotypically different, their skin color is different, but actually that we attach social meaning to that difference. So what is race? Race is a social construct. What does that mean? It means that it's 100% real because we've decided it's real. There's no biological basis for race. You know, what we consider to be the biological basis for race is like slight modifications that groups have had over years and years and years of living places and adapting to them, but that's not actually significant scientifically in any way, shape, or form. And the idea of scientific race has been thoroughly debunked. And at the same time, the acknowledgement that race as a social category is extremely real. So the example I always love to draw on here, and people are like, oh, I never really thought of that, is like the economy, right? Who decided that a cup of coffee is $2? No one really. It was like the market did its thing, and eventually that's where it settled out on the costs and the overhead and the profit margins and all of these things, the cost it costs to bring in the coffee beans and roast them and compensate the farm. You got what I'm saying? Well, why? And when you actually start to unpack that, like, who decided any of this? But at the same time, it's extremely real. You can't just walk in and say, haha, it's a social construct, and walk out with your coffee. It's not how that works. And race is very much the same. So what does it mean to be white? This is where it gets a little bit more complicated, because white has been the norm who has defined race. White itself has actually not really carried a whole lot of meaning to it. And when you think about, people will say, like, what is white culture? And you can't really point to a thing called white culture. At the same time, you also can recognize that it's a skin color, the same way that you can recognize that somebody Black has a skin color. I pass, that's a whole other thing I'll mention later. But that this idea of whiteness is simultaneously the norm, and also does have certain meaning to it based on being the norm. So how is whiteness defined? And the National Museum of African American History and Culture has just like phenomenal resources on this. And I'm not going to read everything on these slides. I just put them there so that when I send them out later, you can have like the longer sort of bits that sort of correspond to this. But they use racialized. I was so thrilled. But whiteness and white racialized identity refers to the way that white people, their customs, culture, and beliefs operate as standard by which all other groups are compared. It's at the core of understanding race in America. Whiteness and the normalization of white racial identity throughout America's history have created a culture where non-white persons are seen as inferior or abnormal. Now, what's really interesting, and I think you'll start to see as I go through this, who counts as white changes. I mean, there's the people who have always been white, mostly sort of white, Anglo-Saxon, Western European. Eastern European was like complicatedly like not quite white. And Italians, I mean, in Boston, I think of that really frequently, and Irish also were not quite white. At the same time, and we'll get into this a little bit later, they were also still white. And it's this weird, and Jews, by the way, and I'll get there, have also always in America occupied that liminal space of not white, not white. So, what is ethnicity? Now, I love to put this on the screen because this is the way we talk about this in Canada. Ethnicity is, this is our clip of our old census form that's changed a little bit. And I'm going to share a funny anecdote once I go through this. But question 17 on the Canadian census asks, what were the ethnic or cultural origins of this person's ancestor? And you can fill in up to 4. And the examples it gives you, it says an ancestor is usually more distant than a grandparent. And you can put in Canadian, English, French, Chinese, East Indian, Italian, German, Scottish, Irish, Cree, et cetera, et cetera. They give you a whole bunch. Now, the funny anecdote that I'll share now is that they base that example list on the top 20 categories from the previous census. And because of demographic changes, Jews were no longer in the top 20. And so few Jews filled out Jewish there that it looked like the Jewish population of Canada was cut in half between one census and another, which it obviously was not. But I think that's a really interesting anecdote to think about like, how do we think of ourselves in terms of ethnicity and race? Then it asks a question about Indigenous. Are you an Indigenous person? And then finally asks the race question. And the race question asks, are you white, South Asian, Chinese, Black, Filipino, Latin American, Arab? It cuts off, but that's basically it. Notably, there's no race category called Jewish. Jewish goes into ethnicity and Jewish goes into religion. So when we're thinking about this, one of the frameworks, people always say, but Jews weren't white, like we were discriminated against, and like 100%, I know I keep bringing up my family, but I think of stories that my mother told me about my grandmother telling her not to tell anyone she was Jewish if she was going to go to the birthday party at the restricted club. And, things like that are very real experiences of exclusion and discrimination. We can think of gentlemen's agreements about not selling property to Jews, the restrictive covenants on land purchases. There's so many examples that I can just rattle off, why there's a Jewish General Hospital everywhere. And in Canada, I know like our main university had a quota for how many Jews they would let into the university. Like, bad stuff. And I always want to start with that and say, like, this is not at all to minimize anti-Semitism. It's just to sort of try to tease apart a little bit of the difference in the way that anti-Semitism functions versus anti-Black racism. And my focus is on anti-Black racism specifically. There are other kinds of racisms that might have similar parallels. Like off the top of my head, some of the issues around taxing immigration from China and things like that off of the top of my head that I can think of, the Japanese internment camps in World War II and every sort of other example. The interesting thing, though, because America was based on white people enslaving Black people, is that in America, it's often been a question of like, are you closer to white or are you closer to Black? And depending on where you fit into that sort of understanding, you might fall out, where you fall out in terms of discrimination might change. So when I talk about legal exclusion, what I'm talking about really is three things: the right to own property, the right to vote, and the right to marry white people. I'm going to come back to that one. That's a big one. It is segregation under the law, right? It was illegal to own property. It was illegal to marry somebody white, and it was illegal to vote. On the social exclusion side, you get private club restrictions, you get neighborhood covenants, you get employment restrictions and quotas. It's de facto. It's all in the realm of sort of civic life. And, it might fall under what we would consider to be human rights codes today, or those sorts of things. Whereas actually, if a Black person married, or if somebody married somebody, like it was illegal to preside over that wedding, you could actually face legal, like criminal consequences for that. Social exclusion can be extreme. I always pull up this sign just because it's from outside Montreal. My grandfather's from Montreal, and like Montreal was not great for Jews. And the sign from Saint Agathe, notice, Jews are not wanted here in Saint Agathe, so scram while the going is good. Interestingly, the French actually reads, Jews are not wanted here. Saint Agathe is a French-Canadian village, and we're going to keep it that way. So it says something slightly different in the French, considerably different in the French to the English. And then the Meadowbrook Swimming Club, these are the signs that you hear about a lot. Privilege of the swimming pools are extended to approved Gentiles only. Legal exclusion, on the other hand, so you have on the one side people protesting segregation and the absence of democracy, so they were absolutely disenfranchised within the country they lived in. And on the other side of the screen, you see the Lovings. Mildred and I think his name was John, my memory is terrible for these things, who were actually the couple who successfully had anti-miscegenation laws struck down at the Supreme Court. They were legally barred from marrying each other, and they managed to challenge it all the way up to the Supreme Court in the 60s. We're not talking about ancient history here. And the famous case Loving versus Virginia, they made a movie of it. I actually haven't seen the movie, so I don't know whether it's good or bad, but they made a movie of it a couple of years ago. And now Loving Day, which is in June, is kind of celebrated by mixed by mixed people as a watershed moment in our right to exist. So how does this play out? And this is also super interesting when you think about race and how entrenched it was. And then I'm going to come back to this. After this, I'm going to sort of loop back to this idea of Jews and marrying white people. There is this really interesting test case, the Rhinelander trial. And what it was New York State did not have anti-miscegenation laws. However, in New York State, Leonard Rhinelander, who was a wealthy young man, married this woman who he then tried to divorce on the grounds of fraud that she had not told him that she was Black. That's actually fascinating, right? That her not disclosing her racial identity was grounds for him to say that he had been defrauded, and therefore, should he annul the marriage, he would have no financial obligation to her. And the scene that you see at the bottom is a very famous scene from the trial, where they had her take down her top in front of the jurors so that the jurors could ascertain for themselves whether he should have reasonably known with his own eyes whether she was Black or not. This is terrible. I don't remember the outcome of the trial because that wasn't the part that stuck with me. The part that stuck with me from this incident was actually that this was actually allowed to come to court, which tells you something about how even in places where there weren't these hard and fast segregation laws, that there were ways to sort of legally segregate people through civic avenues. Now, very quickly, why I talk about marriage quite a bit here is, interestingly, Jews were never barred from marrying white people. We have examples from New York very early on in American history of British Jews marrying into the Delancey family. There's like a letter. I'll tell you, I actually saw this letter for the first time in Karen McGinnity's class at Hebrew College. But there was this letter back to England about how she was going to have to send her son back to find a nice Jewish girl because her daughter had married a Delancey, and like this was like a travesty. And there are not any examples of cases like this. Jews were allowed to marry white people, partially because it was always assumed, especially, interfaith marriages didn't, like, where people retain their faith, didn't really become a thing until later. You would just become a Christian and like whatever. So it was very clear that Jews were seen as like white with this other thing going on that they could kind of shed. Now, at the same time, again, this is not to minimize the fact that there was also at the same time a racial strain of anti-Semitism that, of course, Nazi Germany being the ultimate example, but also white nationalism in the United States, and which is still a threat. So what does race and whiteness mean today? Like, we've spent a whole bunch of time in the past, but how can we understand how this history continues today? And what does it mean to be Jewish? And I always put this little asterisk here. And are white Jews white? So I'm going to present sort of 3 ways that people are thinking of this. White Jews are white is the first. This is the first time I was putting this together. This like fell out of the sky and landed in my lap from the ethicist like the day before. So the ethicist in the New York Times, Kwame Anthony Appiah, writes he's an ethicist, he's a philosophy professor, answers these questions that kind of get into the realm of right and wrong, basically. And the question is, I'm Jewish, I don't identify as white, do I have to check the box white? And he says, look, I know this is like a little quibble right now, but, I bristle at having to list myself as white. There was anti-Semitism when I was growing up. I have relatives who died in the Holocaust. Like, do I have to call myself white? It makes me very uncomfortable. And he says also, like, this is a moral question for him. Jews in the US don't need affirmative action. It's not about that, but he just does not feel white and relate to that category. Why should he list himself that way? And I love this formulation. This is the first line of Kwame Apia's response. Like Jacob and Esau, the racial designations white and black were born twins in America. In other words, you cannot have one without the other. And he talks about a bunch of different things. I'm not going to read all of it, but he talks about essentially two intellectual errors. The first one being that the idea of race presupposes that people who share ancestry and some physical characteristics are actually extremely similar to each other, which that gets to that biological idea of race. And so, people then can be represented as types, the groups that they belong to. And then he says that there's also then that in and of itself is like not correct, but it's value neutral. The intellectual error, he says, though, was compounded by a moral error, that the system of white and black came with commitments to a racial hierarchy, and that coalesced on white people subjugating black people. And he says, so you have this idea of these groups, and you have the idea of superiority, and that actually made both more entrenched. So, he says, like, you would think that that could just go away, and, that Black consciousness can be enlisted in the struggle against racism. And he says, obviously Black people can't get rid of racism. If they could, it would be gone. And he says, look, I get it. There are good reasons for white people in particular to want to abandon whiteness. And he says, one thing is the intellectual error, that it's not true, that there's race is not true. And the other is the moral error. And he says also, like, Jews, because of the experience of anti-Semitism, have that deeper understanding and feeling of racism than white people who have not been victims of it. And he continues, and again, I am not going to read all of this. This is just so that you have it later. He continues and says, the Humpty Dumpty famous line, when I use a word, it means just what I choose it to mean, neither more nor less, Humpty Dumpty says. And Alice looks at him like, that's wild. Words have meaning. And he says, people can't just say, I'm not white, and then the world does not see them as white. And he says, he goes on, basically, it's actually a matter of how the world sees you and how the world sees whiteness. So his answer is yes, white Jews are white. The counterpoint, white Jews are not white. Interestingly, these two first thinkers that I'm putting forward are both Black men, and they're just thinking about this very differently. So Eric Ward, who runs the Western States Law Center, has this phenomenal interview in Tikkun magazine called The Evolution of Identity Politics. And he talks about, Jews start facing less discrimination. They were being defined as white by white society, but also by the left as well. And he says, that Jews got sort of wedged into this weird place of being the white ally. And then if you were like, no, I'm not white, you didn't have like a home on the left anymore. But he said that, and I frankly agree with this, that insisting Jews identify as white and therefore as ultimately possessors of white privilege in its entirety no longer leaves a space to talk about anti-Semitism. And so it became harder and harder to point to anti-Semitism on the left because the right was embodying that sort of racialized anti-Semitism, that Jews are different. And so you could point to it there. And he says, this is sort of his definition. He says, it's more accurate to say that Jews in this country hold a form of temporal privilege. Any semblance of temporal privilege is contingent on the basis that Jews suppress their primary identity of Jews, except in ways found acceptable by larger society. So when a Jew decides to put their Jewish identity first in ways that don't really coalesce with the way society is run, their whiteness disappears. And so this starts to also get to some of those interesting questions that people ask about, for example, when Haredi Jews in Brooklyn are being attacked. Like what is the meaning of that in terms of, oh, if Jews are white, like what is that about? And he says, but what this means, if it can be taken away from you, is that it doesn't mean that Jews are seen as white. It actually means that Jews are seen as not white who get to participate in whiteness. Because he says, like, white people who are white don't live with the threat of their whiteness disappearing. So the final approach that I want to bring is called an intersectional approach, and it's complicating whiteness. Now, just sort of to talk very quickly, this is the last definition of the night about intersectionality. Intersectionality is a phrase that has, or a term that has come to mean something other than what it means because of the way it's been sort of turned into pop discourse. What intersectionality means, it was coined by a legal scholar, Black legal scholar, Kimberly Crenshaw, who was working with Black women in the criminal justice system. And she was looking at their experiences, and those experiences couldn't be explained just by racism, because Black men weren't experiencing the same things. And they couldn't just be explained by sexism, because white women weren't experiencing the same things. What was happening was a new sort of constellation of oppression that was happening because they were Black women. And so the idea of intersectionality grew out of that, understanding that not just your race and gender, but also your religion, your ethnicity, your sexual orientation, your social class, your nationality, your immigration status, ability and disability, your first language, and all of these sort of social categories that people face different ways of being marginalized or oppressed, or whatever language you want to use, can actually mix and match to make new forms. And one of the examples that I always give, just to sort of make a Jewish example, and it's kind of a silly one, but I think it gets to the heart of it, is the idea of the Jewish American princess, right? That's not just anti-Semitic, because it's not about men, but it's also not just sexist, because it's not about non-Jewish women. You have to be a Jewish woman for that stereotype, which is a negative stereotype, to apply. And that's essentially what intersectionality is trying to do. See how the limitations of looking at things through just one lens to try and understand how they play out might work. So it's actually a very useful framework when you think about Jews. And David Schraub, who was on the, I think I can call him Dr. David Schraub now, he finished his PhD recently, who was on the Nexus task force with me. He's a legal scholar and a political scientist, asked the question, what does whiteness do to Jewishness? Let's just assume that Jews are white for a second, but what does that actually mean? And he says, so, you actually end up in this weird thing where if you think that Jews are white, that actually gives credence he says contesting whiteness is a means for white Jews to create space to talk about Jewishness, right? So you want to talk about who you are and what you are, but if you're lumped in as white, then you're that sort of majoritarian culture, and where do you have space to talk about your Jewish identity? This is very heavily academic. The paper is available by PDF, and yes, it's linked here. So when you get these slides, you can go and look at it. But he talks about, actually, this is kind of complicated, because if Jews sit around and say, I'm not white, that actually glosses over the ways in which Jews, white Jews interacting with other racialized groups are and benefit from that structure of whiteness. So you can't say Jews aren't white. At the same time, if you say Jews are white, what happens to Jewishness? And so we're sort of dancing in that little place. He says you don't actually have to find it analytically sound or ethically warranted to understand why Jews want to reject the idea of whiteness. He also talks at some length. It's a fascinating paper, and like actually really got me thinking very hard, is that it actually leaves more room to understand how anti-Semitism functions, to understand how Jews are simultaneously white and not white. Because we all know anti-Semitism generally functions by casting Jews as super powerful, not as not like other racisms that cast people as less than. And so because if Jews are then white and white is power, then Jews are now superpowered because we are white plus. And, so that's kind of some of that piece of understanding how whiteness can be complicated at the same time as being the sort of water we swim in. So why does any of this matter, right? Like, does it matter if Jews are white or not? I'm going to say yes and no. I'm going to start with no. No, it doesn't really matter, because at the end of the day, it's not about how we define ourselves. It's about how we are defined from outside. And ultimately, how we view ourselves has very little to do with whether we are white or not. And as Eric Ward nicely phrases it, that temporal privilege we are given is here right now. Yes, it matters hugely because we interact with other racialized groups through the lens of our race. And this is bringing it back to some of the things I talked about at the beginning about my family. We grew up outside of the Jewish community because of the way that white Jews reacted to our family. There are, I think I have a link to, my mother wrote an article last year as she was sort of processing everything that had happened with George Floyd's murder. And like just remembering all of the horrendous racism that she heard from her family and her Jewish community, that, it's a thing. Jews are not. My colleague Alana Kaufman, who runs the Jews of Color Initiative, once sort of quipped. She's like, it's not like the Jewish community was like insulated in some sort of like a Ziploc bag that like the outside world couldn't get into. The US is racist and we live there. And so of course we absorbed it. Some of the ways that we really see it play out are, for example, how Jews react when a white person is anti-Semitic versus when a Black person is anti-Semitic. And, so much of that I've been sort of, it's something that I actually want to formulate and think through a little bit more sort of long form, but what I've been calling sort of understanding anti-Semitism through the myth of Black dangerousness. The myth of Black dangerousness, of course, being the time that the woman, when my family went to see the Ice Capades when my brother was 6, moved her purse away from the 6-year-old. And my mother, and the experience of race is the fact that I vividly remember it happening. And those are some of the things that as we sort of start to tease out how we understand ourselves as Jews in our community. And when I talk about passing, I feel like I have a very sort of strange relationship to this question, because on the one hand, when we're talking about internally in Jewish spaces, I walk in and no one even bats an eyelash at me or bats an eye at me. On the one hand. On the other hand, that means I get to hear things. And so I kind of play this sort of double role, is like passing unnoticed, but also being an observer of some of the things that happen. And because of my family and because of the experience of having a dark-skinned father and a dark-skinned brother, being acutely aware, both in terms of my identity, the identity that my parents chose to give me pride in of being mixed race, but also in terms of having to make sure that my brother wasn't getting followed around the corner store and those sorts of things. So, when we think about the experience of Jews, one of my sort of big aha moments, I guess, it was a really sad one actually, was after the murder of George Floyd. I was trying to figure out what to write, and one sentence just kept coming into my head, only one sentence, which was something like, I never realized that most Jewish families haven't had the talk about policing with their kids. And, so when we think about that, and when we think about how Jews sit vis-a-vis anti-Black racism, it's very important to understand. So how else is it important to understand? Addressing racism within the Jewish community, as I mentioned, that is directed at Jews of color. It's also directed outwards. And I'm going to use again that example of the way that Jews react to anti-Black racism. There's a phenomenal example that Saturday Night Live has just provided us with. Michael Che, who makes just really, he thinks he's being edgy and he's just being, when I say offensive, I mean that deeply, transphobic and all sorts of other things, made a joke over the weekend on the Saturday Night Report. He said something, I can't remember exactly the wording, but Israel's vaccinated already half of its people. How much you want to bet it was the Jewish half? Not a great joke. Colin Jost, a couple months ago, or I guess it was early in the pandemic, because it was when the lions at the Bronx Zoo had COVID, made the joke. And he made a joke. He said, the lions, blah, 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 they have COVID. Turns out they were at a Hasidic wedding, and shows the lions wearing side curls and a hat. I didn't even know that joke had been made. In the meantime, legacy Jewish organizations are calling for Michael Che to get fired. Those are both problematic jokes, but the way that it's reacted to when a white person makes it versus when a Black person makes it, I encourage you all to pay attention to things like that. And some of the wordings, for example, in statements, I see it a lot where, Representative Steve King read Mein Kampf on the floor of Congress, and was the Republican parties were urged to distance themselves from him. You see other things happen with Black people saying things. Ilhan Omar comes to mind, and I was very offended by what she said. And the calls to have her removed from all the committees, that she's an anti-Semite, the wording is very, very, very strong. And so just paying attention to some of that. Next, combating the growing threat of white nationalism. When I first made this slide, the election hadn't happened yet. The election happened, January 6th happened, but it's not over. Right? It's not over. And unfortunately, white nationalism is growing in Canada as well. And the animating sort of philosophy of a lot of white nationalism is inherently simultaneously anti-Black and anti-Jewish. That Jews, the Great Replacement theory, we think of Charlottesville, the Jews will not replace us. And so many people took that literally, that, they were like, yeah, this tiny minority is not going to replace white people. But the idea actually of the Great Replacement theory is Jews, being the masterminds that we are going to flood America with undesirables like Black people, Latinos, various immigrants, and undermine America from within. For what end, I don't really know, but that is sort of how that works. So our fate is so inherently tied in that. So, when the Ku Klux Klan attacks a Black church, that is an attack on Jews too, and vice versa. Dismantling structural anti-Black racism. This is something that I think is a moral duty. I think, we all see the statistics. We all see how anti-Black racism plays out. And I think, obviously, personally for me, it's very meaningful when Jews commit to it. But I think also just as Jews, that's part of our values, is to improve the world that we live in for everyone, right? Whether you see it as tikkun olam or a light unto the nation, or whatever Jewish framing, B'Tselem Elohim, we were all made in the image of God, whichever, take your pick of the framing. A mixed multitude went out from Egypt. There are just so many moments within our tradition that I think speak to this obligation to improve the world for everyone, because we want to live in a better world. And I'm going to play, just to wrap up for like the next, I'm not playing this whole video. Again, you will get these slides and you can watch it. I just realized though that I forgot to make sure my sound is in the screen share and it looks like they moved it. Is that possible? I'm just going to stop my share and start my share. Oops. Oops. We might have a technical difficulty, but let's see what happens here. Okay. If you can see it or can hear it, give me a thumbs up.
You're just like, people are the worst.
Okay. All right. Now that I've solved the problem, I'm going to introduce the video. So this is so Eli Talks were like the Jewish TED Talks. My friend Alana Kaufman, who I mentioned, also gave one, and it's brilliant. It's about who counts. But Manish Tana, who is a rabbi, Shea Rishon is his actual name, gives a phenomenal talk that sort of plays on his name, what makes this Jew different from all other Jews, race, difference, and safety in Jewish spaces. So I'm just going to play a tiny little clip just to sort of bring us to the sort of end of this conversation and open to questions, which is the question essentially here of what does it mean for Jews to understand white Jews, with an asterisk or however we want to sort of frame that, understand about their sort of place vis-a-vis Jews of color in our community.
Have you ever had one of those days where you're just like, people are the worst kind of people? I had one of those. It was at a friend's Hanukkah party of mine. The music's playing over here, the drinks are over there, and, well, the drinks are over there, so that's where I am. And I'm there, and there's this Jew bro sort of walks up to me. And when I say Jew bro, you kind of know the type, like with like the frosted tips and the hair and like these huge golden Magen Davids where they look like they'd be an extra on something like Jerusalem Shore or something. So anyway, Jew bro comes over to me, he's like, hey, what's up? And I'm like, hey. And he's like, so are you really Jewish or are you just playing around? And I'm like, wait, what? Am I really Jewish just playing around? Are there people that do that? Like, is there just like a flock of black people somewhere going, you know, I just don't feel oppressed enough. Like, I just feel like playing around with something that'll make me black with more black added on. Like I have this craving for food made by people who were absent the day they gave out spices during the Crusades. And they think seasoning is just adding onions and black pepper is spicy. Like, are there black people out there like that? Because if there are, if you know any, like, introduce me to them, because I'd like to know why they're making my life so hard. Because they're probably the reason why when I go into a Judaica shop to pick up a Seder plate, the salesperson comes over to explain to me that I'm picking up a Seder plate, which, whew, bullet dodge there, because I almost walked out of here and thought, it's obviously a 6-person ashtray, so embarrassing. So, and then there's always sort of that hyper-rational person that's like, well, you know, teachable moments, opportunities, and just no, I don't believe in teachable moments and opportunities at my expense. But I very much do believe in demanding that my Jewish be able to enter Jewish spaces and Jewish events just as unassailed as every other Jewish in the room gets to. Yeah, it's just common courtesy, I'd like to say.
Okay, I'm going to stop it there, and hopefully I have whet your appetite to watch the rest of this, because it is phenomenal and it continues on in that really great combination of humor and hard truths that he is phenomenal at. Oops, and apparently I am skipping ahead rather than going to the next slide. There we go. Okay, so that is my last slide. As I mentioned, here is a bunch of sources that you will be able to read that actually ask the question, are Jews white, from like a bunch of different sort of angles. And one thing I will note about the resources here is that most of them are from the Trump era. So it might be really interesting to think about, like, has things changed like after inauguration? Like, do things look different? Or are we sort of stuck with all of these questions that really came to the fore in the last 4 years? So I'm going to stop sharing and I guess open up to questions. And I mean, I can keep talking, but I would much rather hear what your sort of pressing questions are and go from there.
Thank you, Tema. That was fabulous. So I invite people to submit their questions into the chat. There is one question to start us off. And it says, from Catherine Black, years ago in Boston public schools, years ago in Boston public schools were divided white and non-white. The Chinese portion of population sending their kids to Boston public schools said, no, non-white equals black, and we're not black. So school divided into white, non-white, and other. It's a long time in Boston. Jews were white, I'll bet. And there wouldn't have been choice to honor Jews as Jews. Courts were dividing percent of each could go to exam schools. What to do now?
That's a big question. I mean, I think the reality is also, because America is so regional, and so, you know, from place to place, the way that conversations around race and racism played out, you know, whether it was because of states' rights and what the state actually is in charge of and has the ultimate sort of say on, or just because of regional cultural idiosyncrasies, things would sort of appear very different from place to place. I mean, as far as now, I think the questions that I think we need to ask ourselves are some of the harder questions that I've been sort of introduced to the more that I've done this work. As an example, this is a really hard thing that I heard, and I was like very upset by it, but it at the same time didn't fully shock me, that a lot of sort of the really rapid growth of Hebrew day schools came after they integrated public schools. That's a hard thing to hear, because that means that Jews looked at integrated schools, which they might have believed in principle, and said, this is fantastic, we don't want our kids in them. And some of those things, charter schools as well, also comes from similar sort of things. And so when we're looking at the question, and again, this question of are Jews white, are Jews not white, one of the things that I like to say, rather than like, are we white, is like, do we participate in whiteness? Whiteness being the norm, whiteness being sort of the way that society is coded generally, because, you know, ultimately the decision about are we white or not is not ours. Another thing that I think is really interesting to think about, and this is a little bit of a tangent, is I didn't really go into passing so deeply. So what I think is really interesting about passing is that it was so encoded in American law about Blackness that you actually, I mean, there were different times when they identified people of mixed ancestry in different ways. So there was mulatto for a while, which meant mixed. And then they were like, no, this is too broad. So then you could be like mulatto, quadroon, or octoroon, depending on what fraction you are. And then there was like a move away from that. And when they moved away from that, if you were an octoroon, which is 1/8 Black, you were now Black. So I, under census definitions at that time, am Black, the end, not white. Now, when we talk about passing, and this is, I wrote at some length about this in the foreword, when we talk about the idea of passing, and one of the reasons that it actually really like upsets me when Jews say that they pass for white, is that what passing actually meant for people like me would be not to sort of like don't tell or like I'm going to assimilate or something like that, but actually abandoning everything you came from and never speaking a word of who you came from and where you came from ever. To anyone on penalty of losing everything. That is horrifying to think about. And, you know, of course, that's not the time that I grew up in, but it is the sort of emotional baggage that you carry with you is sort of that feeling of not really fully knowing or sort of being aware of what you could lose because of the way race is perceived. And so, you know, I think of like all the trauma we carry as Jews about whether it's pogroms or the Holocaust, and I'm Ashkenazi, so I'm talking about Ashkenazi examples. You know, we carry that. There's also all this other trauma that people who are Black, whether they pass for white or not, also carry. And that for me is a large piece of it.
Thank you. The next question we have is, how can we white Jews be active bystanders to support our non-white Jewish community members on the spot when a situation arises?
Sure. So there's a handful of ways. I think it depends on the situation. So one thing, I'm just going to tell you about what was really meaningful for me in the wake of George Floyd's murder. I was like, as close as you can probably tell, I talk a lot. And I talk a lot and am never really short of words. I was like, nope, don't want to talk, don't want to do anything, can't talk. Like I was just, the only people I was talking to were people who were like going through the same sort of emotional process that I was. And friends started just like bringing me food. It's such a Jewish thing to do. But, you know, I got messages being like, hey, have you eaten today? And, you know, it was like very acute trauma moment of like, actually, you're right, I have not eaten today. And, you know, bringing me healthy food and checking in and just saying, you probably don't want to talk, but if you do, I'm here. So that's like responding to communal tragedy moments. And, you know, what I always say to Jews is just imagine, like, think about how you felt after Pittsburgh and what would have been meaningful for you in that moment from people who were not Jewish to do for you. So that's one. The other is like, what do you do sort of on a more micro level within your own communities to make sure that Jews of color are feeling supported, are feeling welcomed, are feeling understood, and it's not cosmetic, which is, I think, that's the tricky part, right? The superficial stuff is easy. You know, making sure that you invite speakers of color to come sometimes, and you know that your pictures aren't all white people and all of that sort of stuff is the easy stuff. The deeper stuff is actually spending that time understanding how race plays itself in your community. And how you can sort of push back against that a little bit. A lot of that comes with just like a huge amount of self-reflection, and I'm not really sure what else to say. And then the last one I will say is, I think we've all been in this circumstance if we belong to any sort of group that has like less desirable comments directed. You know, if you hear something said, like, please say something. There have been so many situations that I've been in where it's like everyone standing around knows that thing wasn't okay to say because you can see it on their face. They're all looking at me like, oh boy. But no one actually says something to the person who said it. I try really hard if I hear something directed at another group, whether a member of that group is there or not, to call it out in that moment. And I hope that everyone else does that. It's not easy. Like, I actually, despite the fact that I talk a lot and I talk about hard stuff, like confrontation is like not my jam. I really don't like it. But on that, on hearing people say like discriminatory, oppressive, racist, misogynist, homophobic things, if I hear it, I will. I have taught myself that like it's a bigger picture than me and my discomfort here. So yes. So somebody sent me something directly, so I just want to sort of call it out really quickly, which is somebody said that they think it was coincidental that Jewish day schools grew after integration, that the same parents could have sent their children to private schools. It's actually like this is scholarly research that says that this is sort of part of what contributed to it. I don't have it on hand, but if you look for some of that stuff around post-civil rights, Jews become like how Jews became white people and like those books, they talk a little bit about both sort of the move to the suburbs and the creation of separate schools. So yes, if you're going, I mean, if there's also the issue that like a lot of private schools were Christian. And like, of course, you're not going to send your kids to a Christian school. So if you can avoid it. So I just wanted to sort of point that out in case anyone was asking the same question. It definitely wasn't a coincidence. I'm not saying that it's a bad thing. I think day school education is a great thing. I work with day schools all the time. I have friends whose kids are in day school. I have friends who teach at day school. I think they're a great thing. But I think that when we're thinking about how race plays itself out in the Jewish community, it's important to understand that even when our values are like equity and anti-racism, I saw a really funny thing recently that was kind of a joke, and I can't remember where I saw it, but it was like, ask anyone who will say to you like, oh, Black people are treated just fine. And I'm not saying that's what we're saying, but like, oh, like integrated schools, great idea. And then ask them if they'd send their kid to it. Or like, so the joke was, oh, Black people are treated just fine. Well, do you want to be a Black person? And like seeing people's response, most people would, at the same time as they say, no, there's no racism, would also not want to be a Black person. So it's also a very interesting sort of play there.
Thank you. Also, just a piece of housekeeping. There was a question about whether slides and resources will be available later. And yes, we are recording. We will send out a recording and we will send slides. And I'm sure you'll have lots of homework that you can do if you want to. Okay, the next question, very helpful framing, thank you. But do you have an elevator speech for discussions with white Jews who use the "we're not white" argument to deny any complicity and responsibility for racism? Or similarly, point to Rabbi Heschel and say, see, we did our part?
Yeah, okay, so the Heschel one is easy. My line, and like this, I am realizing that the more I do this, the more sardonic I've become. And I don't know if it's just in presentations that I'm this sardonic when I'm like, well, this is what I would say versus what I would actually say. But I'm going to pretend this is what I would actually say. I'm like, if the best you can point to happened in the 60s, like not great, not great. And like, I, of course, like idolize Heschel and the work that he did. But it's also people like look at that one line that he was praying with his feet and they're like, he had like all sorts of, I found recently for another talk that I gave, the speech that he gave at the conference where he actually met Martin Luther King Jr. And he was talking about redlining and like housing insecurity and like really radical stuff. It wasn't just like he walked for voting rights. Like that's not the totality of Heschel at all. And it was so grounded in his deep spirituality and belief in God for him. I do think he was a prophetic voice. So, but my line for the Heschel one is like, come on, you got to do better than the 60s. Like, what have we done since? And people have a hard time thinking of examples of what we've done since. I mean, I spend time with this stuff, so I can think of some, but I think that's the reality there. Now, the elevator speech on white Jews are white. Number one, I think it's really important to point out that actually, avoiding that sort of white Jews, saying we're not white is generally speaking a way to avoid acknowledging how we play a role in racism, which is something that's hard for people to acknowledge. And by the way, Black people play a role in structural racism because structural racism is the water we all swim in. And, you can see, like, this is sort of an extreme example, but you can see so many Black activists, like, deeply critical of Obama as just propagating the systems. And, really interesting sort of ways to think about that. But also, like, if you're not actively pushing against it, you're part of it, essentially. And we can't all be pushing against it all the time. That's, like, not possible. So I just want to flag that. The rest of my sort of elevator speech is like, well, how do people see you before they know that you're Jewish? That to me is a big piece of it. And how do people understand your Jewishness? And this might be different in different parts of the country. I also want to acknowledge that. I hear a lot from people in the South that when people find out they're Jewish, that's like a switch. They are no longer white in their eyes. So I think, that's really important to sort of, and this is why I like that idea of us sort of occupying this liminal space where we're like simultaneously like white and not white. And I think that's a really important sort of way to sort of conceptualize it. But I think, one of the things that I like to ask people, and this I actually do, I don't just say this in presentations, is like, why are you so committed to the idea of not being white? Like, what is it about the idea of being white that freaks you out so much? And people generally can't answer, or they're like, but anti-Semitism. I'm like, okay, but like homophobia, and you can be white and gay. Like, anti-Semitism, yes, can be racialized 100%, but like, are we really going to let the Nazis define who we are? Like, is that where that's what we want to do here? Because the idea, by the way, of Jews being a unique race is a Nazi thing. Like, that's who came up with that, or the precursors to the Nazis. So it's a really interesting thing to think about. It's like, if we're really worried about anti-Semitism, defining ourselves a way that only became the way of defining us by the anti-Semites is not quite, the way we want to do it. That doesn't mean that Jews were seen as equal in Europe. And actually, Europe is still an interesting example because it is much more complicated. But in America, from the second that, boats first arrived, Jews were white in the eyes of the law. I hope that helps. That's not really an elevator pitch.
That was a long elevator ride, but that's okay. Okay, let's see. This one actually is 2 questions. Tema, thank you for your talk. 2 questions. 1, you said something to the effect that we don't get to define ourselves, but rather it is done for us. Is that the opposite of progressive thought? Take, for example, you wrote on your Zoom name, her, she, in an effort for you to define yourself to the outside world. And 2, you said that Jews don't have the talk with their children. I wonder how you think about the Jewish talk we have with our children regarding anti-Semitism, which I had as a young child from a family of Holocaust survivors. And I had with my own children as we faced anti-Semitism with some frequency. I would welcome your thoughts on this.
Sure. So first, a clarification around pronouns. Generally speaking, if you are a cisgendered, so your gender identity matches your gender at birth, and you put your pronouns in, it's actually an act of making it a safe place for people who are trans or non-binary to also have pronouns. So like, I'm not that invested in pronouns, like my pronouns are there. It's sort of it's really encouraged in spaces around inclusion of LGBTQ community to actively put your pronouns there, so that it isn't just the people who don't identify the way that they appear who are forced to give their pronouns. If we all do it, then it's like a normal thing that then people who are trans or non-binary are able to participate in. So I try to model that wherever I can, but also it's something that we do at work quite actively, and I take it very seriously to try and do that. So it isn't actually about me clarifying to anyone what my gender is, so much as me creating a space where gender identity is not actually taken for granted, and people who might identify in ways that is not cisgendered feel safe and not called out by having to clarify their gender. And their preferred pronoun, or sorry, and their pronouns, not preferred, their actual pronouns, how they identify and exist in the world. The second piece about the talk about anti-Semitism, there are talks about all sorts of things. I got talks about sexism and misogyny and keeping myself safe against sexual violence. I got talks about anti-Semitism at great length. You know, I got talks about, you know, all sorts of different things. But when we talk about the idea of the talk is very specifically, you will be seen as a threat and you can be endangered by the or by people who see you as a threat. I'll tell you how the talk happened in my house. My brother, who went to private school that started at a different time than public school, was walking to school alone, wearing his private school pants, but with them a pair of Timberland boots untied and a Nike jacket with a giant swoosh on the back. And, you know, here's a young Black man walking in downtown Toronto, or a boy at this point. He was in like grade 7th grade, as you say. We say grade 7 and Americans say 7th grade, and I try and switch back and forth and I always forget. But, you know, my parents were very worried, and the talk that they gave him was like, this might not be a good idea for you to wear that. And that is a very different talk than anti-Semitism is real and a risk. This was about keeping him physically safe from people who are out there to serve and protect, right? That's our police cars here say to serve and protect. And that when people talk about the talk, that's a lot of what they're talking about. And, you know, that's not to minimize the fact that Jews have talks about anti-Semitism that Christians don't have. Of course, we do. And women are given talks that men aren't. And, you know, gay people are given talks that straight people aren't, and so on and so forth. But when we talk specifically about the talk in sort of American discourse, that's the one we're talking about.
Great. Let's see. We'll go to this one. To me, being white in America means more or less being Christian. No white-skinned group in America other than Jews have to worry about their cemeteries being desecrated, armed guards at their religious schools and places of worship, desecration of memorials to their deepest communal traumas. These are separate and distinct phenomena that characterize the white experience in America. EPA did not address this at all in his article, which was an important omission.
So I didn't reproduce the entirety of his answer. I think he does actually talk about anti-Semitism. It's been a while since I read the full answer. But I think one of the things that's really important to remember is that it doesn't mean not white. Like, this is part of the interesting thing about the social construction. And when I talked about like those distinctions between legal discrimination versus social and civic sort of limitations. Yeah, like I worked in synagogues for years, and, you know, a conversation I would regularly have with my friends was like, yeah, you know, like the thing that you don't do is look over your shoulder to make sure you're safe to go in and out of your workplace. Like, that's not a thing that people who don't work in Jewish communal spaces have to worry about in the same way. So, you know, this is very real. Like, I take anti-Semitism extremely seriously. You know, I spend an inordinate amount of time thinking about it. At the same time, to use anti-Semitism to define the race of Jews is actually using the anti-Semites toolkit against ourselves. The idea of Jews being a distinct race, I mean, just thinking of the idea of there being like a Jewish race is kind of bonkers when you think of the fact, like, you know, we see ourselves, Ashkenazi Jews see ourselves as different from Sephardi Jews and Mizrahi Jews and Ethiopian Jews and Kaifeng Jews, right? Like, this is when we talk about race. And I think, you know, the important thing to remember is race is a social construct. Its meaning changes, who's in and out of what category changes. And just because you are the member of one race doesn't mean that you don't also face some sort of attack and oppression and discrimination on a different basis. And that basis could be ethnic, right? And I think, you know, that's why I brought up that sort of census thing. You know, at different points in time, I mentioned, you know, I think about Boston, the Italians and the Irish were not considered white. They also weren't considered not white. And so this is that interesting dance, right? And I think why I call this talk a complicated conversation is there isn't a straightforward answer, which is why, you know, if you're going to go and read all the things that I recommend, like, I think David Schwab's piece is brilliant because he precisely dances that line of understanding, okay, so if Jews are white now, what does that mean? And how does that actually feed anti-Semitism in interesting ways? Number one, and also how does it impact our own understanding of Jewishness in other ways? And so it's that dance between where society puts us. So for example, Jews don't have a problem getting a loan at a bank, generally speaking. I'm using that as a specific example because that's one of the things that we talk about a lot in structural racism. Jewish communities are not, generally speaking, gerrymandered to reduce their voting power. And that's despite the fact that Jews vote heavily Democrat. You know, and everyone knows that one of the major reasons that Black communities end up gerrymandered is because of the perception that they vote Democrat, partially. But if that was the case, then Jewish communities would get gerrymandered too. And that isn't the case. So you have to ask some of those questions. So all of that is to say, like, absolutely not minimizing anti-Semitism, which is a very real physical threat to Jews, both our physical safety and the safety and sanctity of our spaces and sites, which, look, I've worked in synagogues. Like, I've shown up to work and had a swastika on the building before. That's real, and deeply upsetting. You know, I've been called a dirty Jew in the street before. Like, this is very real. It's also very different than the experience of anti-Black racism.
Thank you. I think I want to thank you, Tema, for stretching our definition of being Jewish and helping us to be better citizens. And I look forward to talking with you to organize a course, hopefully in the fall, so that we can study these thinkers more deeply and reflect more on ourselves as well. So that's, you know, everybody should stay tuned for more information on that. And I thank you all for joining us tonight and being curious and open to new ideas. And I hope you will learn at Hebrew College. Registration is open for classes, and many of which are starting up in March. So you'll be hearing from us for some more opportunities. So I wish you all a good and safe night. And thank you again. Thank you, Tema. This was great. We can stop the recording, Cindy.